All right, the restriction list got updated. It was around midnight, and I was watching Love is Blind. Don't make fun of me. It's a good show. And I got a notification that the restriction list got updated, so we're going to take a peek at what those restrictions are. As you can tell, I'm not at my house right now. I love you, honey. Thank you for letting me borrow your room real quick. So I got the restriction list right here on my phone. This is more of a blind react. Like, I didn't really see it as much as I would like, so I don't really have a script that I'm going off of. But the Alice did get restricted to 2. And then there's a choice of 2 from That Time I Got Reincarnated as a Slime, which is a really interesting choice because this truly means that the English meta and the Japanese meta are completely separate now. And then, of course, we've got Escanor. The guy cannot catch a break. So one thing that is important to note is that Weiss Schwarz actually has a little article that you could go read explaining their choices. I'm not going to read it all verbatim. I do suggest that you go check it out yourself. But one thing that really stood out to me was the Alice being restricted to 2. So in the actual article, Bushiroad has said, "We felt the restricting shout echoing across the battlefield Alice provides a balanced approach to the problem, as players would have an easier time dealing with 2 lanes than with 3. After factoring in the natural variance that occurs within the game, the overall consistency of the deck should be reduced as well." So you could still play the Alice deck with 2 copies. It's going to be a little more rough, but you could still do it. Around the time that the Kurumi from Data Live, the 3-2 Kurumi from Data Live, got restricted, crazy motherfuckers were still playing that deck. So is this going to lower the representation of Alice in the top cut? Yeah, most likely. It's not going to truly stop people from playing the deck. It's still a solid deck. They're not restricting any other pieces, unlike the JP edition, where the Alice Brainstormer was the one that got restricted. And then the Shizu and the Juran got restricted, so you could play one or the other. You can't play both, so 8 arches out of the window. People are saying just play the Milim level 1 and you're good. It's not the most ideal, but it's still an option. And again, like I mentioned, JP doesn't have this restricted yet, but it is restricted in the English edition of the game. And there were even some Japanese talking heads for Weiss Schwarz like mentioning this and like this being news in Japan as well. And then Seven Deadly Sins, poor Escanor. What is crazy is that there wasn't really that much topping from the Escanor. In the article, he mentioned that like about 10% of players were achieving X2, which is that like real grounds of this getting restricted? I don't know. But on the list, on the actual image that they had, one thing that they didn't mention that I'm sure a lot of people who didn't click on the article missed, the Rudy and the Ghislaine are unrestricted. So that means Mushoku Tensei is back, baby. Fuck. I hate playing against that deck. They mentioned in the article that they're cautiously removing the choice restriction, and if anything does changes, they're shoving him right back in. So it's a real Yu-Gi-Oh approach to the restriction list in this aspect. Now, this part I am going to read verbatim from the article because I think it's actually super important to read. There has also been an increased sighting of sharks and goats, but we've decided to keep an eye on the menagerie just a bit longer. Man, they really pulled out the dictionary for this one. Since the number of these sightings aren't currently high enough for us to take action. Not to mention that the upcoming addition to the game of fighters might just change up the smell of the metagame too. So that is an interesting point, that the sharks and the goats haven't been super prevalent to where it truly brings up the restriction. And also has been super solid and might actually change up the restriction list as well, because the reviews for King of Fighters now they're pretty damn good. They're pretty damn solid. Go check out their videos if you haven't yet. So people were upset on Twitter. I'm not calling it X. Can't pay me enough to call it X. And a lot of people are talking about Gura and Overlord, which are 2 fantastic decks, especially with Alice getting restricted, Slime getting restricted, Escanor, it was bubbling under, but it is also restricted. Now the top contenders is going to be Overlord and Gura. Also Kanata Marine, but also those decks have been somewhat prevalent anyways. They've been consistently in the top cut. Fucks, Gura and just like hololive in general has been consistently at the top cut since the inception of the deck. So we're scrolling on Twitter. Kai WCC said Gura stay Gura-ing. Super Shade said hololive escapes a hit once again. Didn't expect the update to SDS, but sure, okay. I said, well, Alice got hit. That's something at least. Friends of the channel Refresh Point WS said Keck, LMAO, they took the bat to the slime archetype. Please run a different one combo. We just finished recording our pre-ban list episode. We'll have a nuanced reaction next week. I'll be watching. Follow Refresh Point. You know where to find him. Kilo said, damn, they went for a hard slime hit. Harder than I expected. Probably just play 4 Mijuran 1-0s now. Diz said, France or BCS will be cancer. Holy shit. Scarada said, Bushy Road absolutely fumbling here. There was a good chance to make some major changes to the game. While better than nothing, leaving Gura unchecked is insane. And that is essentially more or less the general consensus that Gura and just hololive in general should have been hit. It is consistently a top deck. Have you ever died from a level 2? It's not good. It doesn't feel good. Cohen said, kind of crazy Holo just keeps dodging restrictions. And that is another like conspiracy theory I'd say that people do have about this, about hololive and this restriction as well, is that hololive is such a major money pool that they're not going to be hitting it. In a sense, it has main character plot armor. And then one of my favorite tweets is by Dylan Ryu. Let's go. The last few BCSs are going to be so interesting. And I do agree, especially since those decks are not exactly super dead in the water, but there's going to be other contenders for the top cut. It's probably going to be Overlord and Gura. Friend of the channel, Liam said, honestly, people are saying that the restriction list is poor. I think it's good. Having a lane of not having to deal with Alice and also reducing the likelihood of hitting it with the Brainstorm is good. TSK is exactly as I predicted. SDS is a great fix. Well played, Intern Kun. Now, a lot of people complained about the list. A lot of people had opinions on the list. Shit, you're watching a video about someone talking about the list. And absolute fire starter, Boats Don't Sink, absolute legend, Weiss Schwarz OG, absolute legend, said, I appreciate the transparency in the article and the effort put forth, but I do think this list mostly shows a lack of understanding of the current meta, why most people don't like it, and the consequences of restricting certain decks. Now, Weiss Schwarz does have a blue check mark, so they are able to just tweet. I 100% understand dying from level 2 is an unfun experience, and I hate being on the receiving end of the goat and shark shenanigans too. I'll go into a bit more detail here and hope it doesn't come back to bite me. We discussed adding one or both titles to the restriction list, but even knowing the eventual outcome, the data we had on hand at the time of our discussion simply could not support that decision. If we start preemptively hitting what we think would dominate the meta, we would set a dangerous precedence of having to pre-restrict every title. Yes, we did it for the Ayame combo, but we'd like for that to be the exception rather than the norm. So the question then becomes, if we didn't restrict those titles, should we have restricted SAO and TSK? This is where our philosophies may differ, but I lean towards yes, because I don't believe the list makes either of those decks unplayable. As for why certain titles are still on the list, we didn't forget. As much as possible, I have tried to improve transparency, but there are and will always be reasons we cannot disclose. Ultimately, your viewpoint on the list stems from how you approach it in general. If the goal is to nuke every single meta deck, then a new meta deck will always take its place. That to me is simply not viable. That said, I'm not saying the list is perfect, but we genuinely thought about and discussed all the possible alternatives. If it turns out to be insufficient, we will work on it and improve. I generally hope you and the community will give this a chance. And we'll leave it at that. That was a really solid response, and I do think that this is a pretty fine list. This is an okay list. There are some things that really haven't been announced, but like they said, they just didn't get enough tournament data. I'm sure the tournament data will come after this list. So it's announced November 11th, goes into effect November 24th. There's still a couple BCSs along the way. California is along the way. So the last BCS before this list comes into effect is this one right here. So yeah, let me know what you think of the list. Comment down below on all that good stuff. Catch y'all later. Peace.